Chapter 3 on the violent destruction of the human species. The king of Dahomey in the African interior was not so wrong, unfortunately, when he recently told an Englishman, "God made the world for war. All realms, great and small, have always practiced it, although on different principles." Unhappily, history proves that war is, in a certain sense, the habitual state of mankind, which is to say that human blood must flow without interruption somewhere or other on the globe, and that for every nation, peace is only a respite. The closing of the Temple of Janus under Augustus can be cited. There was 1 year in Charlemagne's warlike reign, the year of 790, when there was no war. One can point to a short period after the Peace of Ryswick in 1697, and another equally short after that of Karlowitz in 1699, when there was no war, not only in Europe, but even in all the known world. But these are merely exceptions. Moreover, who can know what is happening over the entire globe at a given time? The century that is just ending began, for France, with a cruel war that was not terminated until the Treaty of Rastatt in 1714. In 1719, France declared war on Spain. The Treaty of Paris put an end to it in 1727. The election of the King of Poland rekindled war in 1733. The peace was made in 1736. 4 years later, the terrible War of the Austrian Succession broke out and lasted without interruption until 1748. Peace was beginning to heal up the wounds of 8 years of war when, 8 years later, the ambition of England forced France to take up arms again. The 7 Years' War is too well known. After 15 years of peace, the American Revolution involved France anew in a war the consequences of which all human wisdom could not foresee. The peace was signed in 1782. 7 years later, the revolution began. It still continues, and it has cost France perhaps 3 million men so far. Thus, considering France alone, here are 40 years of war out of 96. If there are nations more fortunate, there are also many less fortunate. But it is not enough to consider one period of time and one spot on the globe. One must look at the long series of massacres that have soiled every page of history. One sees war raging without interruption, like a continuing fever marked by terrifying paroxysms. I ask the reader to follow the record since the decline of the Roman Republic. In one battle, Marius exterminated 200,000 Cimbri and Teutons. Mithridates slaughtered 80,000 Romans. Sulla killed 90,000 men in a battle fought in Boeotia, where he lost 10,000 himself. Soon you see civil wars and proscriptions. Caesar alone killed 1 million men on the battlefield. Before him, Alexander had had this melancholy honor. Augustus closed the Temple of Janus momentarily, but he reopened it for centuries by establishing an elective empire. A few good princes gave the state a breathing spell, but war never ceased, and under the rule of the good Titus, 600,000 men perished in the siege of Jerusalem. The destruction of men brought about by the Roman armies is truly frightening. The late empire is nothing but a series of massacres. To begin with Constantine, what wars and what battles. Licinius loses 20,000 men at Sybaris, 34,000 at Adrianople, and 100,000 at Chrysopolis. The Nordic peoples begin to move. The Franks, the Goths, the Huns, the Lombards, the Alans, the Vandals, etc. attack the empire and successively tear it to pieces. Attila puts Europe to fire and sword. The Franks kill more than 200,000 of his men near Chalons, and the Goths, the following year, cost him more still. In less than a century, Rome was taken and sacked 3 times, and in a revolt that broke out in Constantinople, 40,000 people were slaughtered. The Goths made themselves masters of Milan and killed 300,000 inhabitants. Totila massacred all the inhabitants of Tivoli and 90,000 men at the sack of Rome. Muhammad appears the sword and Quran overrun two-thirds of the world. The Saracens sail from the Euphrates to the Guadalquivir. The immense city of Syracuse is razed to its foundations. They lose 30,000 men in a single naval combat near Constantinople, and Pelagius kills 20,000 of them in a land battle. These losses were nothing for the Saracens, but the torrent encountered the genius of the Franks on the plain of Tours, where the son of the first Pepin, in the midst of 300,000 cadavers, attached to his name the terrible epithet that distinguishes it still. Islam is carried to Spain and finds there an indomitable rival. Perhaps never has more glory, more grandeur, and more carnage been seen than in the 800-year struggle between Christians and Muslims in Spain. Several expeditions, several battles even, cost 20, 30, 40, up to 80,000 lives. Charlemagne ascends the throne, and there is a half-century of fighting. Every year he decrees death for some portion of Europe. Active everywhere and everywhere the conqueror, he wipes out iron-strong nations as easily as Caesar wiped out the effeminate men of Asia. The Normans begin that long series of ravages and cruelties that still make us shudder. Charlemagne's immense heritage is torn apart. Ambition covers it with blood, and the name of the Franks disappears at the Battle of Fontenay. All Italy is pillaged by the Saracens, while the Normans, Danes, and Hungarians ravage France, Holland, England, Germany, and Greece. The barbarian nations are finally established and tamed. This vein yields no more blood. Another is opened immediately with the beginning of the Crusades. All Europe throws itself on Asia. The number of victims can be counted only in myriads. Genghis Khan and his sons subjugate and ravage the world from China to Bohemia. The French, who are involved in crusades against the Muslims, also crusade against the heretics in the cruel Albigensian War. In the Battle of Bouvines, 30,000 men lose their lives. 5 years later, 80,000 Saracens perish at the siege of Damietta. Guelphs and Ghibellines begin the conflict that will stain Italy with blood for so long. The torch of civil war is kindled in Germany. Then the Sicilian Vespers. Under the reigns of Edward and Philip of Valois, France and England hurl themselves at each other more violently than ever and create a new era of carnage. The massacre of Jews, the Battle of Poitiers, the Battle of Nicopolis. The vanquisher falls under the blows of Tamerlane, who repeats Genghis Khan. The Duke of Burgundy has the Duke of Orleans assassinated, and the bloody rivalry of these two families begins. The Battle of Agincourt. The Hussites put much of Germany to fire and sword. Mohammed II reigns and fights for 30 years. England, forced back within its own frontiers, is torn apart by internal troubles as the houses of York and Lancaster bathe the country in blood. The Burgundian heiress joins her states to the House of Austria. And in this marriage contract, it is written that men will slaughter each other for centuries, from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. The discovery of the New World means the death sentence for 3 million Indians. Charles V and Francis I appear on the world stage, and every page of their history is red with human blood. The reign of Suleiman, the Battle of Mohacs, the Siege of Vienna, the Siege of Malta, etc. But it is from the shadow of a cloister that there emerges one of mankind's very greatest scourges. Luther appears. Calvin follows him. The Peasants' Revolt, the 30 Years' War, the Civil War in France, the Massacre of the Low Countries, the Massacre of Ireland, the Massacre of the Cevennes, St. Bartholomew's Day, the murders of Henry II, Henry IV, Mary Stuart and Charles I, and finally in our day, from the same source, the French Revolution. I will not carry this frightful catalogue any further. Our own century and the preceding one are too well known. If you go back to the birth of nations, if you come down to our own day, if you examine peoples in all possible conditions From the state of barbarism to the most advanced civilization, you always find war. From this primary cause and from all the other connected causes, the effusion of human blood has never ceased in the world. Sometimes blood flows less abundantly over some larger area. Sometimes it flows more abundantly in a more restricted area. But the flow remains nearly constant. But from time to time, the flow is augmented prodigiously by such extraordinary events as the Punic Wars, the Triumvirate, the victories of Caesar, the eruption of the barbarians, the Crusades, the wars of religion, the Spanish Succession, the French Revolution, etc. If one had a table of massacres similar to a meteorological table, who knows whether, after centuries of observation, some law might not be discovered? Buffon has proven quite clearly that a large percentage of animals are destined to die a violent death. He could apparently have extended the demonstration to man, but let the facts speak for themselves. Yet there is room to doubt whether this violent destruction is, in general, such a great evil as is believed. At least, it is one of those evils that enters into an order of things where everything is violent and against nature, and that produces compensations. First, when the human soul has lost its strength through laziness, incredulity, and the gangrenous vices that follow an excess of civilization, it can be retempered only in blood. Certainly there is no easy explanation of why war produces different effects in different circumstances. But it can be seen clearly enough that mankind may be considered as a tree which an invisible hand is continually pruning, and which often profits from the operation. In truth, the tree may perish if the trunk is cut, or if the tree is ever pruned, but who knows the limits of the human tree? What we do know is that excessive carnage is often allied with excessive population, as was seen especially in the ancient Greek republics and in Spain under the Arab domination. Platitudes about war mean nothing. One need not be very clever to know that when more men are killed, fewer remain at the moment, just as it is true that the more branches one cuts off, the fewer remain on the tree. But the results of the operation are what must be considered. Moreover, following the same comparison, we may observe that the skillful gardener directs the pruning less towards lush vegetation than towards the fructification of the tree. He wants fruit, not wood or leaves. Now, the real fruits of human nature, the arts, sciences, great enterprises, lofty conceptions, manly virtues, are due especially to the state of war. We know that nations have never achieved the highest point of the greatness of which they are capable, except after long and bloody wars. Thus, Greece's most brilliant hour was the terrible epoch of the Peloponnesian War. The age of Augustus followed immediately the Civil War and the proscriptions. French genius was hewn by the League and polished by the Fronde. All the great men of the century of Queen Anne were born in the midst of political upheavals. In a word, we can say that blood is the manure of the plant we call genius. I wonder if those who say that the arts are the friends of peace really know what they are saying. It would at least be necessary to explain and circumscribe the proposition, for I see nothing less pacific than the centuries of Alexander and Pericles, of Augustus, of Leo X and Francis I, of Louis XIV and Queen Anne. Could the shedding of human blood possibly not have serious causes and serious effects? Let us reflect, history and fable, the discoveries of modern physiology and antique tradition, all unite to furnish material for these meditations. We should not be more ashamed of speculating on this subject than on 1,000 others less relevant to man. In the meantime, let us thunder against war and try to teach sovereigns an aversion to it. But let us not give in to the dreams of Condorcet, that philosophy so dear to the Revolution, who used his life to prepare the unhappiness of the present generation, graciously willing perfection to posterity. There is only one way of restraining the scourge of war, and that is by restraining the disorders that lead to this terrible purification. In the Greek tragedy of Orestes, Helen, one of the characters in the play, is taken away by the gods to the just resentment of the Greeks and placed in the sky beside her two brothers to be a guiding sign to navigators. Apollo appears in order to justify this strange apotheosis. Helen's beauty, he says, was only an instrument that the gods used to set the Greeks and Trojans against each other to cause their blood to flow, in order to quench on earth the iniquity of men become too numerous. Apollo spoke very well. Men gather the clouds, and then they complain of the tempests that follow. It is the anger of kings that arms the earth. It is the anger of heaven that arms the kings. I know well that in all these considerations we are continually troubled by the wearisome sight of the innocent who perish with the guilty. But without becoming deeply involved in this most profound question, we can consider it solely in the light of the age-old dogma that the innocent suffer for the benefit of the guilty. It was from this dogma, it seems to me, that the ancients derived the custom of sacrifices that was practiced everywhere, and that was judged useful not only for the living, but also for the dead, a typical custom that habit has led us to regard without astonishment, but whose roots are nonetheless difficult to discover. Self-sacrifices so famous in antiquity come from the same dogma. Theseus had faith that the sacrifice of his life would be accepted by the divinity, and that he could use it to balance all the evils that menaced his country. Christianity came to consecrate this dogma, which is perfectly natural to man, although appearing difficult to arrive at by reason. Thus, there could have been in the heart of Louis XVI, in that of the saintly Elizabeth, such an impulse, such an acceptance, capable of saving France. Sometimes it is asked, of what use are these terrible austerities, which are also self-sacrifices practiced by certain religious orders? It would be precisely the same thing to ask, of what use is Christianity, which rests entirely on an enlargement of this same dogma of innocence paying for crime? The authority that approves these orders chooses certain men and insulates them from the world in order to make them conductors. There is nothing but violence in the universe, but we are spoiled by a modern philosophy that tells us all is good, whereas evil has tainted everything, and in a very real sense all is evil, since nothing is in its place. The keynote of the system of our creation has been lowered, and following the rules of harmony, all the others have been lowered proportionately. All creation groans and tends with pain and effort towards another order of things. The spectators of great human calamities especially are led to these sad meditations. But let us not lose courage. There is no chastisement that does not purify. There is no disorder that eternal love does not turn against the principle of evil. It is gratifying, amid the general upheaval, to have a presentiment of the plans of divinity. We will never see the complete picture during our earthly sojourn, and often we will deceive ourselves. But in all possible sciences, except the exact sciences, are we not reduced to conjecture? And if our conjectures are plausible, if there are analogies for them, if they are based on universally accepted ideas, above all if they are consoling and suited to make us better men, what do they lack? If they are not true, they are good, or rather, since they are good, are they not true? Having envisaged the French Revolution from a purely moral point of view, I now turn my speculations to politics, without, however, forgetting the primary aim of my work.